The tour begins, a lesson in fear. Commander Virik of the Zarkonian Empire had spent his life studying war. He had seen empires rise and fall, watched fleets reduced to drifting wreckage, and commanded forces that had crushed entire civilizations beneath the relentless advance of the Zarkonian military machine. He had trained under the greatest strategic minds of his species, honed his instincts in brutal planetary conquests, and carried the weight of victory after victory. And yet, as his ship descended toward Earth, he felt something unfamiliar. Unease. This was supposed to be a simple diplomatic exchange, a friendly tour of one of humanity's premier military academies, a gesture of goodwill, meant to build relations between the humans and the Zarkonian High Command. The humans, despite their growing presence in the galactic stage, were still considered young and reckless compared to the more established warfaring species. So why did he feel like he was stepping into something he did not understand? The docking clamps engaged, locking his shuttle into place. The bay doors hissed open, revealing an open-air tarmac beneath a steel-gray sky. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, metal, and something else he couldn't quite name. His second-in-command, Lieutenant Kor, shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Commander," he muttered in a low voice, "this doesn't feel right." Virik understood. Everything here felt off, not in the way of deception, but in something far worse. The humans had invited them in with confidence, offering an inside look at their military training. That alone was suspicious. No species willingly revealed the core of its strength unless it had something to prove, or something to warn them about. As they stepped down onto the training grounds, they were met by Major Ethan Kessler, a human officer clad in a dark green uniform. His build was imposing, his posture relaxed but commanding, his eyes sharp with an intensity that was unreadable. "Commander Virik," Kessler said, offering a firm handshake. "Welcome to Westward Military Academy, where we forge warriors who refuse to lose." Virik took the handshake, the human's grip firm, unyielding. There was no arrogance in his tone, no boastfulness, just certainty. That was the first sign that something was wrong. "This way," Kessler said, leading them toward the first set of training fields. "I think you'll find our methods illuminating." The first shock, a battlefield in training. The first thing that struck Virik as deeply unsettling was the mud. It was everywhere. The sky had darkened with rain, and the open training grounds had turned into a thick, swamp-like mess of dirt and water. But the human cadets, hundreds of them, were crawling through it, covered from head to toe, faces streaked with sweat and grime. They weren't just enduring it. They were thriving in it. Instructors screamed orders as the cadets dragged themselves under barbed wire, their muscles trembling, their breaths ragged. Others sprinted across an obstacle course of towering walls, rope climbs, and jagged trenches, their movements fluid despite the exhaustion written across their bodies. Virik had expected precision drills, controlled combat simulations, structured discipline. Instead, he saw organized chaos, and it unnerved him more than any battlefield he had ever stood upon. "You call this training?" Virik muttered, eyes narrowing. "This is torture." Kessler chuckled, unfazed. "We call it the gauntlet. It weeds out those who think they want to be soldiers and forges those who are meant to be soldiers." Virik turned to Kor, who looked as disturbed as he felt. "Kessler," Virik said, voice level, "Zarkonian troops undergo extensive holographic training. We perfect strategy, combat efficiency, and battlefield control. This is nothing but suffering for the sake of suffering." Kessler glanced at him with a smirk. "And that," he said, "is why we win." The words landed like a punch to the gut. The Zarkonians prided themselves on efficiency. Battles were planned down to the smallest detail, minimizing risks, optimizing resource usage, and ensuring a clean, calculated victory. The humans, they embraced the brutality of war itself. "You don't train them to fight," Kor whispered under his breath. "You train them to endure." Kessler nodded. Pain is an excellent teacher. A test of limits. The crucible. They moved deeper into the facility, where Virek witnessed what would become the turning point in his understanding of humanity's military doctrine. At the center of the training grounds was a massive obstacle course, unlike anything he had seen before. A twisted, nightmarish gauntlet of barbed wire, ice-cold water trenches, electrified crawl spaces, and high walls that required near-superhuman endurance to conquer. "What is this?" Virek asked, dreading the answer. Kessler grinned. "This is the crucible, the final test before graduation." Virek watched as exhausted cadets, already bruised and battered from previous drills, were thrown into the course. Some were limping, some were shaking with exhaustion, but none stopped. "They do this," Virek murmured, "after days of training." "Not just days," Kessler corrected. "We deprive them of sleep. We ration their food. They are pushed to their absolute limit. Then we push them further." Virek felt his stomach tighten. This was insanity. "Why?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Kessler turned to him, expression unreadable. "Because war will never be fair," he said. "It will come when they are exhausted, when they are out of options, when everything is against them. If they can endure this, they can endure anything." Virek swallowed hard. The Zarkonians fought wars efficiently, but humans fought wars mercilessly, not just against their enemies, but against themselves. And that realization filled him with something he had never felt before. Fear. The moment of realization. The last part of the tour took them to a live fire range, where cadets practiced in simulated battle conditions. Explosions shook the ground. Gunfire filled the air. Smoke billowed from nearby bunkers as young soldiers moved through it like seasoned veterans. Virek felt his pulse quicken. They weren't just trained to fight. They were trained to survive at all costs. Kessler folded his arms. "You came here to study us, Commander, to understand how we fight." Virek turned to him slowly. "I came here thinking I had something to learn. Now I realize I came here to be warned." Kessler's lips curled into a knowing smile. "Good. That means the lesson worked." Virek felt an unsettling chill run through him. The Zarkonians had always seen themselves as superior. Their fleets were vast, their strategies impeccable. But now, standing here, he realized that they had never truly understood war. Not like humans did. And that changed everything. The breaking point. Commander Virek had seen enough, or so he thought. The mud-soaked obstacle courses, the relentless endurance training, the unyielding discipline. It was all beyond anything he had ever witnessed. The Zarkonian military prided itself on precision, efficiency, and superior strategy. But what the humans were doing, it was something else entirely. And now, Major Kessler was leading them deeper into the facility, towards something even worse. "This next part," Kessler said, glancing back at Virek and Lieutenant Kor, "is where we separate the strong from the unbreakable." Virek stiffened. "The others were already broken," he muttered, eyeing the shattered, exhausted cadets staggering from the previous training grounds. Kessler grinned. "No, they were just warmed up." A new definition of strength. The next area was a sealed-off combat training ground, surrounded by high steel walls and observation platforms. Heavily armed human instructors stood by the gates, their armor marked with scars from past battles. Virek frowned. "You put your drill instructors in combat armor." Kessler nodded. "Of course, these aren't just teachers. They fight alongside their cadets." Virek's stomach churned. In Zarkonian academies, instructors were untouchable. They were commanders, tacticians, and philosophers, but they did not fight alongside their trainees. "Inside this arena," Kessler continued, "is where cadets experience what we call the breaking point." Kor tensed beside him. "And what exactly does that mean?" Kessler simply opened the gates. Inside, Virek saw something that should not have been possible. A group of cadets, half-starved, sleep-deprived, physically exhausted beyond all reason, were fighting. Not against targets, not against simulations, but against fully trained, combat-ready veterans. Virek's breath caught in his throat as he watched a young human cadet, a mere 18 cycles at most, stand toe-to-toe against a seasoned, battle-hardened soldier. The cadet's movements were sluggish, unstable, and yet, he did not stop. Every time he was knocked down, he stood up again. Every time he failed to block a strike, he gritted his teeth and kept moving. His muscles screamed with fatigue, but his eyes burned with something Virek could not define. "He's already lost," Kor muttered. "Why doesn't he yield?" Kessler folded his arms. "Because humans don't yield. Not until the fight is over. Survival, no matter the cost." The fight continued. The cadet's nose was broken. His arm hung limply from his side. Yet when his instructor told him to stop, he snarled. "Not yet." Kor took an uneasy step backward. "He is too wounded to fight," he whispered. "He should be taken to medical." "Not yet," Kessler said, mirroring the cadet's words. Virek clenched his fists. This was madness. "What do you gain from this?" he demanded. "What is the purpose of breaking your own soldiers before they ever see war?" Kessler turned to him, his expression unreadable. "You still don't get it, do you?" Virek stared in silence. Kessler gestured toward the cadet, who was now barely able to stand, his entire body trembling with effort. "This cadet is beyond exhausted. He has nothing left in him. But when we ask him to fight, he does. Because war does not care how tired he is. War does not wait for him to be ready. War will come at his weakest moment." The instructor finally delivered a final brutal strike, and the cadet collapsed into the mud. But before the human soldiers could remove him, the cadet did something that made Virek's blood run cold. He crawled forward, his entire body shaking, broken, unable to stand, yet he still tried to reach his opponent. Virek had commanded elite Sarkonian soldiers for decades. They were warriors, ruthless, efficient, powerful. But none of them, none, would have done this. Kessler's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of everything Virek had seen. "This is what makes humans dangerous, Commander. It is not our weapons. It is not our technology. It is not our numbers." His eyes darkened. "It is this, the absolute refusal to break." The fear begins to take hold. Virek felt something crawl beneath his skin. Fear. Not the fear of defeat. He had experienced that before. This was different. This was the fear of something he could not understand. The Zarkonians prided themselves on superior tactics, overwhelming firepower, and unbreakable formations. They crushed opposition before it had the chance to retaliate. But humans fought as if pain did not matter, as if injury was just an inconvenience, as if death itself was something to be denied. And that made them something entirely new. "Commander," Kor whispered, his own voice shaking slightly. "If this is what they do to their own soldiers, imagine what they do to their enemies." Virek did not need to imagine. He already knew. Kessler watched them, as if sensing their realization. Then, with an almost casual cruelty, he said, "And this is only the first half of their training." Virek's stomach dropped. There was more. His claws flexed involuntarily, his instincts screaming at him to leave this place immediately. But he could not. He had to see. He had to understand. Because if his people ever faced these humans on the battlefield, he needed to know how to survive them. And at that moment, he wasn't sure that was even possible. The cost of becoming unbreakable. Commander Virek had seen enough. Or so he thought. Major Kessler led them deeper into the academy, past the combat pits and the brutal endurance fields. The echoes of the cadets' grunts and strained breathing still lingered in the air, along with the faint smell of blood, sweat, and mud. Virek's mind raced, still grappling with what he had just witnessed. Humans didn't train for war like other species. They'd broke themselves before anyone else could. Every instinct in Virek's body told him to end this tour, report back to the Zarkonian High Command, and warn them, but something stronger kept him walking forward. He had to understand. Because if a war ever came between their species, he needed to know one thing. Can humanity even be defeated? The isolation chambers, a test of the mind. Kessler stopped in front of a thick, reinforced door, far away from the open training fields. The walls here were cold, sterile, unlike the rest of the Academy's rugged outdoor environments. This, Kessler said, resting a hand on the door, is where we train their minds. Virek narrowed his eyes. What could possibly be worse than what I've already seen? Kessler's lips curled into a grim smile. Pain is easy to endure when it comes from an enemy, but when your mind turns against you, that's when the real battle begins. The door slid open. Inside, a row of sealed isolation chambers stretched down a dimly lit corridor. Each chamber had a small window, barely large enough to see inside. "What is this place?" Kor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Psychological resilience training," Kessler replied. "We placed them in here, alone, without contact, without light, without sound, for as long as it takes." Virek's blood ran cold. He stepped forward, peering into one of the small windows. Inside, a young cadet sat motionless, his face hollow, his body stiff. His uniform was disheveled, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. And yet, he did not break. Even in total silence, in total isolation, he endured. "How long has he been in there?" Virek asked, feeling something deep in his gut that he couldn't quite name. Kessler shrugged. "A week? Maybe more. Time doesn't mean much when you're in there." Virek pulled back, staring at the human major in horror. "This is torture." Kessler laughed softly. "No, Commander. This is preparation." Kor stepped forward, his antenna twitching in distress. Preparation for what? Kessler's expression darkened. For war. For capture. For moments when the only thing keeping them alive is their mind. Virek knew what he meant. He had interrogated prisoners of war before, species that folded under pressure, that broke when subjected to mental and emotional suffering. But these humans, they trained for it. They welcomed it. They were unbreakable in ways that no species should be. And that realization sent a chill through Virek's entire being. The final test, fear itself. They left the isolation chambers behind, but the heavy weight of dread followed them. Virek had learned two undeniable truths. Humans were trained to endure physical agony beyond comprehension. They conditioned themselves to resist mental collapse at all costs. But there was still one thing missing. "Where are we going now?" Kor asked, his voice uneasy. Kessler didn't answer at first. He simply led them to a large dark building, its walls reinforced, its entrance guarded by armed soldiers. Virek's instincts screamed at him. Whatever is inside here is worse than anything you've seen before. "This," Kessler finally said, stopping at the entrance, "is the Fear Lab." Virek frowned. "Fear Lab?" Kessler nodded, his face unreadable. "Every species has fears, Commander. Some are afraid of death. Some fear pain. Some fear things that lurk in the dark." He turned to them, eyes gleaming. "We stripped those fears away." The doors slid open. Inside was complete blackness. Virek stepped forward cautiously, his claws clicking against the floor. The air inside was thick, heavy, like stepping into a vacuum. There was no sound, no movement, just an overwhelming stillness. And then he heard it. A scream. Not of pain, not of anger, of pure, primal terror. Kor's antennae stiffened in alarm. "What is this place?" Kessler sighed. "This is where they learn to fight past fear." Virek clenched his fists. Fear is a survival mechanism. It keeps soldiers alive. Kessler shook his head. "No, Commander. Fear is a weakness, And we do not allow weaknesses in our military. As they moved deeper inside, Virik began to see the cadets. They were alone, each locked in individual chambers, their bodies rigid, their breathing shallow. They weren't being physically harmed, but their minds were under siege. Each of them is facing their worst nightmare, Kessler explained. Custom-programmed neural simulations designed to exploit their deepest fears. Some are reliving their own deaths. Some are facing monsters that don't exist. Some are trapped in scenarios where everyone they love is gone. Virik's blood turned to ice. And what happens when they can't take it? Kessler's smile vanished. Then they don't graduate. Virik's throat went dry. How many fail? Kessler exhaled slowly. Not as many as you'd think. That was the worst part. Most of them survived this. Most of them learned to shut off their fear entirely. Virik had never been afraid of war before. But now, standing here, he was afraid of what humans had become. A horrifying realization. The tour ended. Virik and Kor were escorted back to their ship, but neither of them spoke as they stepped inside. The silence between them was heavy, suffocating. Virik had come to study humans. He had expected brutality, raw aggression, and military efficiency. But what he had witnessed was something far more terrifying. Humans were not just warriors. They were monuments to suffering, not because they were weak, but because they had mastered turning pain into strength. "Commander," Kor finally whispered, his voice hoarse. Virik turned to him, expecting a question. Instead, Kor's eyes were filled with a fear he had never seen before. "If a war comes," he said, his voice shaking, "how do we stop them?" Virik did not answer, because in that moment, he realized the truth. You don't stop them. You survive them. And even that was not guaranteed. The price of becoming invincible. Commander Virik had seen horrors on the battlefield. He had watched cities burn under Zarkonian bombardments, seen the faces of fallen soldiers frozen in expressions of pain and terror, and listened to the desperate cries of enemies who realized, too late, that surrender was no longer an option. Yet none of it compared to the unease settling deep in his chest. The humans weren't just training to fight. They were training to become something beyond mortal limits. And now, as Major Kessler led them toward the final leg of their tour, Virik realized something even more terrifying. They had not yet seen the worst of it. The final phase, welcome to the abyss. The sun was setting over the facility as Kessler stopped in front of a massive underground bunker. Unlike the previous training areas, this one was isolated, fortified, and under heavy security. "You wanted to understand how we train," Kessler said, punching a code into the door panel. "Now you'll see the final step in creating a human soldier." The heavy doors slid open with a hiss of pressurized air. A cold draft swept through the hallway, carrying the sterile scent of metal, sweat, and something else, something unnatural. Virik stepped inside, his instincts screaming at him to turn back. The labyrinth, training beyond death. The corridor stretched into a maze of dimly lit tunnels, with doors on either side. Kor glanced around nervously, his antennae twitching. "This is no longer a training facility," he muttered. "This feels like a prison." Kessler chuckled. "In some ways, it is." The walls bore deep scratches, as if something had clawed at them in desperation. Virik slowed his pace, the unease deepening. "What are you training them for?" he asked cautiously. Kessler didn't respond immediately. Instead, he led them to a large steel observation window. Virik peered through, and what he saw sent ice through his veins. Inside the chamber, a cadet stood alone. He was emaciated, hollow-eyed, trembling on his feet, yet there was no hesitation in his stance. Surrounding him were machines, robotic drones, each armed with non-lethal but painful shock weaponry. Without warning, the drones attacked. Blades flashed, electricity crackled. The cadet dodged the first strike, twisted away from the second, but the third slammed into his ribs, sending him to the ground. Virik expected the fight to end there. It didn't. The moment the cadet hit the floor itself shifted, pulling him into the ground. Virak took a step back. What is happening? Kessler folded his arms. This is the labyrinth, where we push our soldiers past the limits of what they believe is possible, beyond breaking. The labyrinth's purpose. The cadet was swallowed into total darkness. The walls around him moved, shifting and rotating. There was no way to tell up from down. Then, without warning, the chamber filled with blinding light and deafening noise. Gunfire, screams, explosions. A simulation. No, this was something more. He believes it's real, Kor whispered, horrified. You've tricked his mind into thinking he's in battle. Kessler nodded. Exactly. Virak clenched his fists. How long does this last? Kessler's face was unreadable. Until he stops fighting. Virak turned back to the window, watching as the cadet struggled to crawl, to breathe, to escape. Yet there was no escape. He was alone, fighting phantoms that his mind could not separate from reality. You said fear was a weakness, Virak said slowly. But this is terror conditioning, Kessler interrupted. We make them live in the worst war zones imaginable, over and over, until fear means nothing to them. The word sent a chill down Virak's spine. And if they break? Kessler's expression turned cold. Then they don't graduate. Monsters in the making. The cadet finally staggered forward, his body on the verge of collapse. The simulation did not stop. More enemies appeared. More nightmares. Yet he kept moving. Kept fighting. Kept killing. Virak realized something then. Something that shook him to his core. Humans didn't just train to win wars. They trained to survive them, no matter the cost. Kor turned to Virak, his voice barely above a whisper. They're creating something that isn't human anymore. Virak agreed, because standing before them was not a soldier. It was something worse. It was a being that could never be broken, never surrender, never feel fear again. And the galaxy was not ready for them. The final lesson. Virak could not watch anymore. He turned away from the observation window, his mind reeling. The Zarkonians had always believed themselves to be the superior warriors, the masters of strategy and discipline. But humanity had built something terrifyingly different. Why are you showing us this? Virak finally asked. Kessler's grin disappeared. Because the Zarkonians are considering war with us, he said, his voice quiet but firm. And if that happens, he gestured back to the chamber, where the cadet, now void of hesitation, void of doubt, void of fear, stood completely still, waiting for the next fight. If that happens, you will lose. Virak knew it was true. He had come here to study humanity. Instead, he had come to fear them. And now, as the tour came to an end, he had one final duty. To return to the Zarkonian High Command and tell them one thing. Never go to war with humanity. Because humanity had done something no species should ever do. They had defeated fear itself. And nothing in the universe could stand against them now.